On a chilly Monday morning in Oakland, California, the municipal courthouse buzzed with its usual activity. The old building's wooden benches creaked under the weight of waiting citizens, while fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow over everyone below. It was 9:45 a.m., and Courtroom 4B was about to witness an unexpected encounter that would change more than just one life. Dr. Maya Washington sat quietly in the front row, her back straight and her expression calm. She was dressed professionally in a navy blue blazer and matching pants, with her natural hair styled in neat twists. At 35 years old, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had faced many challenges and emerged stronger. Her hands rested carefully on the folder in her lap, containing documents she hoped she wouldn't need today. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmur of the courtroom. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Richard Harrison presiding." The sound of shuffling feet and rustling clothes filled the air as everyone stood. Judge Harrison entered, his black robe flowing behind him as he took his seat at the bench. At 58, his gray hair and stern expression gave him an imposing presence that had intimidated countless defendants over his 15-year career. Case number 2024 CR 789, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing in the now silent room. City of Oakland versus Maya Washington, charges of trespassing and disrupting business operations. Dr. Washington rose smoothly from her seat, walking to the defendant's position with measured steps. As she moved, several people in the gallery watched intently. Among them was Mrs. Jenkins, an elderly woman from West Oakland who had known Maya since she first moved to the neighborhood 5 years ago. There was also Marcus Thompson, a local community organizer who had worked with Maya on various projects but never expected to see her in court. Judge Harrison looked down at the case file, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose. His eyes scanned the document quickly, too quickly. He had seen hundreds of protest cases before, and in his mind, this was just another one. The security footage photos showed the defendant at the entrance of Berkeley Chemical Corporation, standing with a group of protesters. His lips tightened slightly as he noted the destruction of property charges. "Ms. Washington," he began, emphasizing the Ms. without looking up, unaware of her credentials. "You stand accused of leading a group of protesters who trespassed on private property and disrupted business operations at Berkeley Chemical Corporation on April 15th. How do you plead?" The courtroom remained silent as Dr. Washington responded, her voice clear and steady. "Not guilty, Your Honor." There was no tremor in her voice, no sign of the nervousness that usually accompanied first-time defendants in his courtroom. This caught Judge Harrison's attention, making him look up properly for the first time. "You understand," he continued, his tone carrying years of practiced authority, "that we have video evidence of you and your group forcing your way onto private property, that your actions resulted in the company losing thousands of dollars in business operations." Dr. Washington stood her ground, her posture unchanged. "Yes, Your Honor, I understand the charges." Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced on the bench before him. The morning light streaming through the high windows cast shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of disapproval. He had seen this scenario play out countless times. Protesters who thought their cause justified breaking the law, who didn't understand the consequences of their actions. "Given the evidence before me," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "and considering the cost to the business, I'm setting the fine at $10,000. This court needs to send a message that such disruptive behavior will not be tolerated in our city." A soft murmur rippled through the courtroom. Mrs. Jenkins clasped her hands together in worry, while Marcus Thompson shook his head slightly. The fine was unusually harsh for a first-time offense, and everyone knew it. But Dr. Washington's expression didn't change. Instead, she calmly opened the folder she had brought with her. "Your Honor," she said, her voice still steady, "before you finalize that decision, I believe there are some facts about this case that you need to know." The judge's eyebrows raised slightly, not used to such composed defiance. He had no idea that the next few minutes would completely change his perspective, not just about this case, but about his own deeply held assumptions. Judge Harrison shifted in his chair, visibly annoyed by what he saw as a delay tactic. The morning sun had grown stronger now, streaming through the high windows of Courtroom 4B, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. He had 12 more cases to hear before lunch, and this one was already taking longer than he planned. "Ms. Washington," he said sharply, emphasizing the Ms. again. This court's time is valuable. If you have evidence pertaining to your case, it should have been submitted to the prosecution beforehand. He lifted his gavel slightly, a warning gesture that most defendants quickly understood. But Dr. Washington remained unruffled. She pulled out several photographs from her folder, each one carefully labeled and dated. Your Honor, I have here documented evidence of illegal chemical dumping by Berkeley Chemical Corporation, taken over a period of 6 months. Her voice carried across the courtroom, clear and professional. The prosecutor, James Mitchell, quickly rose to his feet. Objection, Your Honor. This is irrelevant to the charges of trespassing and property damage. His face was flushed, and his tie slightly askew, suggesting he hadn't expected any real challenge from this case. In the gallery, the tension grew. Mrs. Jenkins leaned forward, her aged hands gripping her purse tightly. Marcus Thompson had pulled out his notebook and was writing rapidly, his eyes darting between Dr. Washington and the judge. Other observers, who had come for their own cases, found themselves drawn into the unfolding drama. Judge Harrison's face darkened. Ms. Washington, the prosecutor is correct. Whatever complaints you may have against this company should be filed through proper legal channels. Breaking the law is not the answer. He picked up his gavel again, ready to end the discussion. With all due respect, Your Honor, Dr. Washington continued, her calm demeanor unchanged. These documents were submitted through proper channels 3 times over the past year. She pulled out a stack of dated receipts from various government offices. Each time, the complaints were mysteriously lost or marked as insufficient evidence. The judge paused, his gavel hovering in midair. Something in her tone made him hesitate. It wasn't the usual defensive anger he heard from protesters. This was different, methodical, professional, prepared. Furthermore, she continued, taking advantage of his momentary pause, the location where I was arrested isn't just private property. It's a public health hazard that's actively harming the West Oakland community. She pulled out more papers, official-looking documents with government letterheads. The prosecutor jumped up again. Your Honor, please. This is clearly an attempt to turn a simple trespassing case into a publicity stunt. But his voice wavered slightly as he caught sight of the documents in Dr. Washington's hands. Judge Harrison frowned, his earlier certainty beginning to crack. He had handled hundreds of protest cases, but something about this one felt different. The defendant's composure, the organized documentation, the lack of theatrical activism he was used to seeing, it all suggested there might be more to this story. Ms. Washington, he began, then caught himself as he noticed the doctor prefix on one of her documents. Dr. Washington, he corrected, his tone slightly less harsh. Are you suggesting that your actions were in response to a public health threat? The courtroom grew even quieter. Mrs. Jenkins nodded silently in her seat, tears forming in her eyes. Marcus Thompson had stopped writing, his pen hovering over his notebook as he waited for the response. No, Your Honor, Dr. Washington replied, her voice steady but passionate. I'm not suggesting it. I'm proving it with scientific evidence gathered over 2 years of research. She placed a thick binder on the evidence table. This contains data from soil samples, water testing, and air quality measurements, all showing dangerous levels of toxic chemicals that exceed EPA standards by over 300%. Judge Harrison's expression shifted slightly. For the first time that morning, he looked at the woman standing before him, really looked at her. He noticed her professional attire, her dignified bearing, the intelligent gleam in her eyes. He began to realize that his initial assumptions about this case, and about her, might have been seriously misplaced. The morning sun now filled the courtroom completely, illuminating specks of dust floating in the air, as if the very atmosphere was charged with anticipation of what would happen next. The weight of silence in courtroom 4B grew heavier as Dr. Maya Washington opened another folder. The sound of papers rustling seemed unusually loud in the quiet room. Even the usual squeaking of the old courthouse chairs had stopped as everyone leaned forward, waiting to hear what would come next. Your Honor, Dr. Washington began, her voice carrying a quiet authority, I'd like to properly introduce myself to the court. She pulled out a series of credentials and awards, laying them carefully on the evidence table. I am Dr. Maya Washington, lead environmental researcher at the Berkeley Climate Change Institute, and I hold a PhD in environmental science from Stanford University. Judge Harrison's eyes widened slightly, He reached for his reading glasses, putting them on to examine the credentials more closely. The prosecutor, Mr. Mitchell, shifted uncomfortably in his chair, loosening his tie further. For the past decade, Dr. Washington continued, I've been studying the effects of industrial pollution on minority communities across California. My research has been published in over 20 scientific journals. She placed several academic papers on the table, their covers showing prestigious journal names that even Judge Harrison recognized. Mrs. Jenkins, still sitting in the gallery, whispered to those around her, That's our Maya. She's not just any protester, she's our guardian angel. Several community members nodded in agreement, their faces showing pride. Dr. Washington pulled up a large map of Oakland on a portable display stand she had brought. Red dots marked various locations around the West Oakland area. These marks show where we detected dangerous levels of chemical pollution, she explained, her finger tracing a pattern that centered around Berkeley Chemical Corporation's facility. Last year, my team discovered that childhood asthma rates in neighborhoods surrounding the facility are 3 times higher than the national average. She placed medical statistics reports on the table. We also found increased rates of certain cancers and respiratory diseases in these areas, which are predominantly inhabited by minority communities. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. The morning's simple trespassing case had transformed into something far more complex. He looked at the prosecution. Mr. Mitchell, were you aware of Dr. Washington's credentials and the nature of her research? The prosecutor stood, his face now visibly flushed. Your Honor, while Dr. Washington's credentials are impressive, they don't change the fact that she broke the law by trespassing. Actually, Dr. Washington interjected politely. According to Environmental Protection Act Section 1432, citizens have the right to gather evidence of environmental violations when there's reasonable suspicion of immediate public health risks. She handed a copy of the law to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Harrison. Marcus Thompson, still taking notes in the gallery, smiled slightly. He had watched Dr. Washington teach environmental law to community members for years. Now she was educating the court itself. Furthermore, she continued, pulling out time-stamped photographs, our team detected dangerous levels of chemical emissions on the day of the alleged trespassing. These emissions exceeded legal limits by 500%. She placed an air quality meter reading next to the photos. We entered the property not to protest, but to gather critical evidence before it could be hidden or disposed of. The courtroom atmosphere had completely changed from an hour ago. Judge Harrison was now leaning forward, examining each piece of evidence with careful attention. The same man who had been ready to impose a harsh fine was now seeing the deeper story unfold before him. Your Honor, Dr. Washington said, her voice taking on a note of passion while maintaining its professional tone, I stand before you not as a reckless protester, but as a scientist and a concerned citizen. The real crime here isn't trespassing. It's the systematic poisoning of an entire community that lacks the resources to fight back through traditional legal channels. The sun had shifted in the sky, and the courtroom's lighting had changed. The harsh fluorescent glare was now mixed with natural light, illuminating Dr. Washington as she stood tall, surrounded by the evidence of her life's work. Judge Harrison looked at her with new eyes, seeing not the defendant he had prejudged, but a dedicated professional fighting for environmental justice. The courtroom's attention remained fixed on Dr. Washington as she moved to present her most compelling evidence. She opened a large metal case that had been sitting beside her desk, pulling out several sealed glass containers filled with water samples. These samples, she explained, holding up a container of murky brown liquid, were collected from the groundwater near Berkeley Chemical Corporation over the past 6 months. She placed them carefully on the evidence table, each bottle labeled with dates and location coordinates. The water should be clear, but as you can see, it's not. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his reading glasses back on his nose. The prosecutor, Mr. Mitchell, had stopped objecting and was now watching with visible concern. In the gallery, Mrs. Jenkins pulled out her phone and quietly showed her neighbor pictures of her garden's withered vegetables, victims of the same contaminated water. Dr. Washington projected a series of graphs onto the portable screen. These charts show the increasing levels of toxic chemicals in the soil and water over the past 3 years. She pointed to a sharp upward line that started in 2021. This spike occurred right after Berkeley Chemical Corporation doubled its production capacity. She then displayed photographs of children playing in a nearby park, followed by medical records with personal information carefully redacted. In this neighborhood, childhood asthma cases had increased by 200% since the facility expanded. Her voice remained professional, but her eyes revealed her deep concern. These are real children, real families affected by corporate negligence. Marcus Thompson stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, may I approach?" After receiving a nod from Judge Harrison, he walked forward with a thick folder. As a community organizer, I collected statements from over 50 families affected by these pollutants. Dr. Washington nodded gratefully at Marcus before continuing. She pulled out a series of satellite images showing the factory at night. These thermal images, taken by environmental monitoring satellites, show chemical releases happening during the night shift, when the company thought no one was watching. The judge studied the images intently. The black and white photographs clearly showed plumes of emissions rising from the facility's stacks, timestamped between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on multiple dates. But the most disturbing evidence, Dr. Washington continued, her voice growing slightly harder, is this. She played a short video on her laptop, showing it to the judge. The footage, taken from her team's research cameras, captured trucks dumping barrels of waste into a hidden drainage system late at night. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Even the bailiff, who had seen countless cases, raised his eyebrows in surprise. Judge Harrison's face darkened as he watched the video, his earlier skepticism completely gone. "We tracked these illegal dumping activities for months," Dr. Washington explained, showing a map marked with red dots indicating dump sites. "Each location corresponds to areas where we later found elevated levels of toxic chemicals." She laid out soil sample reports next to each marked location on the map. Mrs. Jenkins stood up slowly, her voice shaking with emotion. "Your Honor, may I speak?" After receiving permission, she walked forward with difficulty, leaning on her cane. "I've lived in West Oakland for 60 years. My grandchildren can't play in our backyard anymore because the air makes them sick. Dr. Washington is the only one who took our complaints seriously." The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his chair as more community members nodded in agreement. The evidence was becoming overwhelming, transforming what had seemed like a simple trespassing case into something far more significant. Dr. Washington pulled out one final document, a thick research paper published in the Journal of Environmental Science. This peer-reviewed study, which I authored with my team, conclusively links the increased health issues in West Oakland to specific chemicals used exclusively by Berkeley Chemical Corporation. She handed copies to both the judge and the prosecutor. Judge Harrison removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. The morning's proceedings had revealed a pattern of corporate misconduct that went far beyond a simple trespassing incident. He looked at Dr. Washington with new respect, recognizing that her actions were not those of a casual protester, but of a dedicated scientist fighting for environmental justice. Judge Harrison sat back in his chair, his earlier stern expression replaced by one of deep thought. The morning light had shifted, and shadows danced across the wood-paneled walls of courtroom 4B. He looked down at his notes, then at the mountain of evidence before him, and finally at Dr. Washington, seeing her as if for the first time. "The court will take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice lacking its earlier harsh tone. "Dr. Washington, Mr. Mitchell, please remain." The bailiff called out for everyone to rise as Judge Harrison left the bench, disappearing into his chambers. Once inside, he loosened his black robes and sat heavily in his leather chair. On his desk lay a framed photo of his own grandchildren playing in their backyard. He picked it up, thinking about Mrs. Jenkins's words about her grandchildren unable to play outside. The parallel struck him hard. Meanwhile, in the courtroom, people spoke in hushed whispers. Mrs. Jenkins patted Dr. Washington's shoulder as she passed by, while Marcus Thompson continued updating his notes. The prosecutor, Mr. Mitchell, sat alone at his table, loosening his tie completely and flipping through Dr. Washington's research papers with a troubled expression. In his chambers, Judge Harrison pulled out his own copy of the Environmental Protection Act, reading through Section 1432 carefully, his legal pad filled with notes as he considered precedents and previous cases. But more than the law, he thought about justice, real justice, and his role in it. When he returned to the courtroom 15 minutes later, Something had changed in his bearing. The stern mask of authority had been replaced by something more thoughtful, more human. The bailiff called the court back to order, and everyone settled into their seats, the air thick with anticipation. "Dr. Washington," Judge Harrison began, his voice softer than before, "I owe you an apology." A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Judges rarely apologized, especially not in open court. "I made assumptions about you and your actions without examining the full context. That was wrong of me." He picked up one of the soil sample reports, holding it up. "This evidence shows not just scientific data, but a pattern of environmental racism that cannot be ignored." He turned to the prosecutor. "Mr. Mitchell, has your office investigated any of these allegations against Berkeley Chemical Corporation?" The prosecutor stood, tugging at his collar. "No, Your Honor. We weren't aware of the extent of the situation." Judge Harrison nodded slowly, then turned back to Dr. Washington. "You could have published your findings and waited for the slow wheels of justice to turn. Instead, you chose direct action, knowing it might cost you personally. That takes courage." He picked up another photograph, this one showing children playing near the factory's fence line. The law must serve justice, not just order. When companies abuse their power to harm communities, especially minority communities, sometimes civil disobedience becomes a moral necessity. The courtroom remained silent, hanging on every word. Mrs. Jenkins wiped tears from her eyes. Marcus Thompson's pen flew across his notebook, recording every word. Even the bailiff stood straighter, sensing the historical importance of the moment. "Dr. Washington," the judge continued, "you entered that property not as a trespasser, but as a scientist gathering crucial evidence of ongoing harm to public health. Your actions fall squarely within the protections of the Environmental Protection Act's emergency evidence collection provisions." He looked around the courtroom, making eye contact with various community members present. This court has a duty not just to enforce the law, but to ensure justice is served. Sometimes, that means recognizing when our initial judgments were wrong. Judge Harrison straightened in his chair, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "More importantly, we must recognize when the true crime is not the act of protest, but the injustice being protested against." The morning sun now streamed fully through the windows, illuminating the judge's bench as if nature itself approved of this transformation. The same man who had started the morning ready to impose a harsh fine now sat as an ally of environmental justice, his understanding permanently changed by the evidence and humanity before him. As Judge Harrison's words settled over the courtroom, Mrs. Jenkins slowly rose from her seat again. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was strong as she spoke. "Your Honor, if I may, there's something more about Dr. Washington that the court should know." The judge nodded, gesturing for her to continue. The elderly woman made her way to the front, her cane tapping softly against the worn carpet. Behind her, other community members stood up one by one, ready to share their stories. 3 years ago, Mrs. Jenkins began, my grandson Tommy couldn't breathe properly. The doctors kept giving him different medications, but nothing helped. She pulled out a small inhaler from her purse. That's when Dr. Washington came to our neighborhood meeting at the community center. Marcus Thompson stepped forward next, his notebook now closed. She didn't just come once, he added. Dr. Washington spent every weekend for 6 months testing our air, our water, and our soil. She used her own money to buy testing equipment for the community. A young mother named Sarah Rodriguez stood up, holding her sleeping toddler. When my daughter developed a mysterious rash, none of the doctors could tell us why, she said, her voice catching. Dr. Washington tested our tap water and found chemical levels that were off the charts. She helped us get a water filtration system installed. The prosecutor, Mr. Mitchell, watched silently as more community members came forward. Each person had a story about how Dr. Washington had helped them understand and document the environmental dangers they faced daily. James Cooper, a local high school science teacher, approached the bench next. Dr. Washington didn't just do research, he explained, pulling out a stack of educational materials. She created a citizen science program at our school. She taught our students how to monitor air quality and collect data. These kids aren't just victims anymore, they're young scientists fighting for their community. The judge examined the student projects, noting the careful methodology and clear presentations. Dr. Washington had turned the community's struggle into an educational opportunity, empowering the next generation to understand and combat environmental injustice. Maria Gonzalez, owner of the local grocery store, stepped forward with photographs. "Look at our community garden before and after the factory expanded," she said, laying out the pictures. The first showed lush vegetables and fruits, the second showed withered plants and discolored leaves. Dr. Washington helped us prove it wasn't just bad luck or poor gardening. She showed us how the soil had been poisoned. As each person spoke, the full impact of Dr. Washington's work became clear. She hadn't just gathered scientific data, she had given hope and knowledge to a community that had long been ignored by authorities. Robert Lee, a retired postal worker, shared his story next. "When my wife got sick, we thought it was just age," he said quietly. "But Dr. Washington's research showed that our street had the highest concentration of toxic chemicals in the neighborhood. Thanks to her evidence, we got the medical care my wife needed." The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Washington wiped away a tear. These weren't just cases or statistics to her. They were people she had come to know and care about deeply. The community's support showed that her work went far beyond professional research. Judge Harrison listened intently to each testimony, his expression growing more determined with each story. The morning's proceedings had revealed not just environmental crimes, but also the profound impact one dedicated person could have on an entire community. Mrs. Jenkins returned to the front one last time. "Your Honor," she said, her voice full of emotion, "Dr. Washington didn't break the law that day at the factory. She upheld a higher law, the law of protecting her community, of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves." The sunlight streaming through the window seemed to grow stronger, illuminating the faces of all those who had spoken. In that moment, Courtroom 4B wasn't just a place of law. It had become a forum for community voices that had too long gone unheard, united in support of the woman who had become their champion. Judge Harrison sat in thoughtful silence for several moments after the community members finished speaking. He then opened a thick law book on his bench, its pages marked with colorful sticky notes. The entire courtroom watched as he referenced several landmark cases, his expression growing more resolved with each page he turned. "Dr. Washington," he began, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration, "your case has brought to mind several important legal precedents that this court must consider." He lifted a document, showing it to the court. The 1978 case of Environmental Defense Fund versus Southwestern Chemical showed that scientific evidence gathered through civil disobedience could be admitted in court if public health was at immediate risk. The prosecutor, Mr. Mitchell, shifted in his chair but remained silent. His earlier objections had been replaced by a look of growing understanding. Even he could see that this case was becoming a turning point in environmental law. Judge Harrison continued, pointing to another case file. In 2015, the California Supreme Court ruled in Martinez versus Pacific Industries that protecting public health could justify entering private property under specific circumstances. He looked directly at Dr. Washington. "Your actions align perfectly with these requirements." Marcus Thompson furiously scribbled notes as the judge spoke. As a community organizer, he knew these legal precedents could help other communities facing similar battles. Mrs. Jenkins smiled proudly, squeezing her neighbor's hand as they listened. "But perhaps most relevant," Judge Harrison said, pulling out a more recent case file, "is the 2022 decision in Community Health Alliance versus Riverside Manufacturing. That ruling established that environmental scientists have a special duty to document and report dangerous pollution levels, even when traditional reporting channels have failed." Dr. Washington nodded slightly, familiar with these cases. She had studied them carefully before taking action at Berkeley Chemical Corporation. Her preparation hadn't been just scientific, it had been legal as well. The judge then did something unusual. He stepped down from his bench, walking to the evidence table where Dr. Washington's research lay spread out. "This court is not just deciding a simple trespassing case today," he announced, picking up one of the soil sample reports. "We are establishing how our justice system responds when science and civil rights intersect with environmental protection." He turned to face the gallery, speaking directly to the community members present. "Throughout history, our legal system has had to evolve to address new challenges. The civil rights movement, women's suffrage, labor rights. All these causes required the courts to recognize when old laws needed new interpretations. The bailiff, who had seen thousands of cases in his 20 years of service, straightened his posture, sensing the historical importance of the moment. Even the court reporter paused briefly, making sure to capture every word perfectly. Today, Judge Harrison continued, returning to his bench. We face a new civil rights frontier, environmental justice. When corporations abuse their power to harm vulnerable communities, when they hide their actions behind property rights, the law must adapt to protect those who cannot protect themselves. He picked up Dr. Washington's published research paper, holding it up for all to see. Science and law must work together. We cannot allow property rights to become a shield for environmental crimes, especially when those crimes disproportionately affect minority communities. The sunlight streaming through the courtroom windows had reached its peak intensity, casting a warm glow over the proceedings. Judge Harrison looked at his watch, then at the faces before him, Dr. Washington's determined expression, the hopeful community members, even the prosecutor's thoughtful frown. This case, he declared, his voice firm with conviction, will serve as a precedent for future environmental justice cases in this district. When scientists like Dr. Washington take principled action to protect public health, they are not criminals. They are defenders of the public good, acting in the highest traditions of both science and civil rights. The courtroom remained perfectly still, everyone present understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would be referenced in environmental law cases for years to come. Judge Harrison's words weren't just clearing Dr. Washington's name, they were creating a legal shield for other scientists and activists fighting similar battles across the country. Judge Harrison straightened his robes and cleared his throat, preparing to deliver his final verdict. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across courtroom 4B, marking the end of a day that had started as a simple trespassing case and transformed into something much more significant. "Will the defendant please rise?" he announced, his voice carrying a new tone of respect when addressing Dr. Washington. She stood gracefully, her professional demeanor unchanged from the morning, though her eyes showed deep emotion. "Before I deliver my verdict," Judge Harrison began, "I want to acknowledge something important. This morning, I walked into this courtroom carrying prejudices I didn't even realize I had." He paused, looking directly at Dr. Washington. "I saw a black woman accused of trespassing, and I made assumptions. I was wrong." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judges rarely admitted their biases so openly. Mrs. Jenkins dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while Marcus Thompson's pen raced across his notebook, capturing every word. "Today's proceedings have shown us that justice isn't just about following the letter of the law," the judge continued. "It's about understanding the context, the science, and most importantly, the human impact of our decisions." He lifted the stack of evidence Dr. Washington had presented. "The court has reviewed extensive scientific data, community testimony, and legal precedents. Based on this evidence, I am making the following rulings." The courtroom fell completely silent. Even the usual creaking of the old wooden benches stopped as everyone held their breath. "First, all charges against Dr. Maya Washington are hereby dismissed." He paused as a wave of relief swept through the gallery. "Furthermore, I am issuing a formal commendation for her dedicated work in environmental science and community protection." Mrs. Jenkins couldn't contain herself, letting out a quiet "Thank the Lord." Several community members reached over to squeeze her shoulders in shared joy. "Second," Judge Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger, "I am ordering an immediate investigation into Berkeley Chemical Corporation's activities. The evidence presented today suggests serious violations of environmental law that cannot be ignored." The prosecutor, Mr. Mitchell, nodded in agreement, already making notes on his legal pad. His earlier opposition had transformed into determination to pursue the real wrongdoers. "Third," the judge added, "I am establishing new guidelines for handling environmental protest cases in this court." He held up a document he had been drafting during the brief recess. "These guidelines will require judges to consider scientific evidence and community impact before making any rulings on cases involving environmental activism." Dr. Washington remained standing, her posture straight, but her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The victory wasn't just for her, it was for every community facing environmental injustice. Finally, Judge Harrison said, removing his reading glasses, "I want this case to serve as a reminder to our legal system. When we see someone in our courtroom, we must look beyond our initial assumptions. We must see the whole person, the whole story. He turned to address the entire courtroom. Dr. Washington came here today facing criminal charges. She leaves as a hero who has helped establish new protections for both scientific inquiry and community health. The judge stood, adding solemnity to his final words. This court formally recognizes Dr. Maya Washington's actions as being in the highest tradition of both scientific integrity and civil rights activism. Let the record show that sometimes standing up for environmental justice requires the courage to challenge our existing systems. As the gavel fell one last time, the afternoon sun broke through the clouds, flooding the courtroom with golden light. Community members rushed forward to hug Dr. Washington, while reporters who had gathered during the day hurried out to file their stories. Marcus Thompson approached Dr. Washington with tears in his eyes. "This isn't just a victory for West Oakland," he said. "This is a victory for every community fighting for environmental justice." Mrs. Jenkins was the last to reach Dr. Washington, embracing her tightly. "You stood up for us," she whispered, "and justice stood up for you." As people began filing out of the courtroom, Judge Harrison watched from his bench, knowing that this day would be remembered not just in legal textbooks, but in the story of how one determined scientist helped transform environmental justice in America.